Thank you. So I decided to talk about something very specific, something really we did along the way when we were working on biological problems. And the reason that I chose to talk about this is obviously I don't want to talk about diffusion, network diffusion, because everybody's talking about that, right? But besides that, I really enjoyed doing this work, and I think it can be handy if you are doing enumerative tasks for some reason that I don't understand, but and also I'm expecting that somebody will tell, oh, this is already known. Okay, so since we are in the Institute for Theoretical Computer Science, my contribution to this project was really telling Sean did all the work, and repeatedly telling him that, come on, Sean, this must have been done. But I was never able to show him that actually this was done. So I think in that sense it is interesting. And Mark's contribution was really, Mark is the biological contributor to the project, and his contribution was to keep reminding him that we want the software out, not the proofs. And Sean did all the work. And I will try to explain it as much as I can understand from what Sean did. So I will start with the problem description. We have a graph, we have a network, which is usually a biological network, at least, our inspiration is that, right? So we are talking about a network with thousands of edges and thousands of nodes and 10,000s of edges. And we have an objective function to maximize. I mean, you can also minimize it, but, let's focus on maximization. So essentially, we want to identify connected subgraphs that maximize that objective function, that maximal connected subgraphs that satisfy a quantifiable property, essentially. That's our goal. So in molecular networks, this is interesting because connected means functionally related. And of course, you can also generalize the notion of connectivity as well. So we also assume that there is a bounding function. So this can either be a hereditary property, or we might be able to bound the score of a subgraph given the scores of its subgraphs. Okay, so the idea is essentially, can we use enumerative algorithms or branch and bound algorithms efficiently if we have such a bounding function, or if it is hereditary? If the property that we are looking at is hereditary. So in terms of the applications, I mean, I encountered this problem twice in my life. But, just to give you an example, for example, you can think of this as, one simple example is if you want to enumerate all maximal clicks in a graph, then you can define the problem in these terms by just letting the score to be equal to the size of the subgraph, right? And then making it equal to 0 if it is not a clique. Okay? So you can map many different graph problems that require enumeration to this setup. So I encountered this problem first when I was implementing algorithms for graph mining in the context of network alignment. But then in the context of systems biology of cancer, we developed an algorithm which I want to talk about a little more in detail, where here we were trying to identify groups of function-related proteins such that at the gene expression level, when we look at the binary gene expression profiles, the states, specific states of the subgraph provide information about the phenotype. So we described this, we defined the scoring function in terms of the mutual information by decomposing the mutual information between the state of a subgraph and the phenotype. And then we were looking for essentially subgraphs such that, that there is significant statistical dependence between the state of that subgraph in terms of the gene expression and then and the phenotype. So the good thing about this was when we defined the objective function this way, then we were able to bound the score of a subgraph of a set of vertices given the scores or given simple statistics of its smaller subgraphs. So then, I mean, for these tasks, you usually develop a greedy algorithm, and it is sufficient, right, for the purposes of getting something biologically significant. But we had this nice bound, so we went ahead and implemented an enumerative algorithm, and then we implemented the same same optimization problem using a greedy algorithm, and we were able to show that actually if you do enumeration, you can find subnetworks that are better in terms of performing predictive tasks as opposed to the greedy algorithm. So there we were able to show that yes, actually doing more than greedy algorithms, searching beyond greedy algorithms can be useful. So then we went ahead and also applied this algorithm to glioblastoma, finding markers of survival in glioblastoma, and they were validated at the protein level as well. So we were able to identify proteins that are not measured in terms of protein, but in terms of protein expression, but we were able to go ahead and really test them in the lab and see that actually we can pick up these proteins that don't show up in the gene expression data, but when we apply this algorithm, we can pick those up and they are indeed differentially expressed at the protein level. So we were really happy with this algorithm with one problem. It was implemented in MATLAB, in a rush. So this was done by Selim Chaudhry. So Selim did a great job developing this algorithm, but he implemented it so that he can test it quickly. So it was a mess that only people who really knew what was going on could use it. So we wanted to implement it in such a way that everybody, even the domain scientists, can use it. So that was Sean's task. Sean was tasked by implementing this algorithm in a clean way so that everybody can use it. But then Sean noticed something, and actually, I mean, this is, if you think about it, you will observe this immediately. So in our original implementation, we were enumerating the subgraphs in depth first order. And when you enumerate the subgraphs in depth first order, you can't achieve the fourth condition here, which is actually really what you need if you want to efficiently use an enumerative algorithm. Essentially what it says is, if I will use a bounding function, right, to prune out subgraphs without testing them, then I need to generate and evaluate all subgraphs of a given subgraph before I generate and evaluate that subgraph, so that I can really use this pruning efficiently. And if you enumerate subgraphs in depth first order, obviously you can't do that. Okay? The rest of the conditions that we specify here, really we figured them out with Sean. Those are kind of obvious. Essentially you want to generate everything possible, right? Because you are developing an enumerative algorithm. Second, you don't want any overhead in the sense that if you will generate a set of nodes, you want them to be connected. You don't want to generate a set and then check whether they are connected. And third, you don't want any redundancy, meaning that you want to generate everything exactly once, not more than once. And it's a difficult thing to do when you are enumerating subgraphs, right? Everybody who dealt with subgraphs know that very well. So essentially diving into the main problem, we call it a redundant rejection when we happen to test a subgraph that is not actually promising. So if we could be able to eliminate a subgraph without even generating it, but we happen to generate it, then that's a redundant rejection. So we want to get rid of redundant rejections completely, but if it is not possible, we at least want to minimize the number of redundant rejections. So this is the problem setup. So again, when Sean came up with this idea, I kept telling him that, oh, Sean, this is so fundamental that it must be done. It must have been done. So we looked at it again. I talked to a few people. So essentially, these are the obvious ways of enumerating subgraphs of a graph. Right? You can either do breadth-first enumeration, which is good because which will satisfy all the conditions all the properties that we desire. But it will be very costly in terms of memory. If you generate subgraphs in breadth-first order, then you will have to remember everything that you generated before you start combining them, and it is not feasible.
So before you already told us about are these induced or not induced?
These are induced subgraphs. So you are generating sets essentially with the constraint that they are connected. Now, if you do it in that first order, then it's very efficient in terms of memory. You don't really need to keep anything, right? But it badly fails optimal order of enumeration, because since you do it in that first order, only one subgraph of a subgraph will be generated, and then that subgraph will be generated. All other subgraphs will be generated after that. So then when I talk to people on how this can be done, almost everybody said, oh, yeah, you can do it using reverse search. And at that point, I noticed when we looked at reverse search, I noticed that this is probably why people didn't pay attention to this problem before, because reverse search really does it, but it does it if the graph is small, right? And sparsity is not a concern. Here we are dealing with graphs where we have thousands of nodes and 10,000s of edges. Reverse search does not take into account sparsity. It generates subsets and then checks for connectivity. If you do it with a protein interaction network where you have thousands of nodes, the subset space is much larger than the connected subgraph space because of connectivity, so you can't apply reverse search. So the algorithm that Sean developed, and we published this in ALCOB. If you are familiar with the conference, I don't know now, it is going into its third year. It's a new European conference in algorithms in computational biology. So we published it in the first year of that conference, and then we moved on. I mean, Sean doesn't want to do anything beyond this point. But the two contributions of his algorithm was first, the idea of using anchor vertices to simplify the problem. I will explain that. And second, using a hybrid of depth first and breadth first enumeration so that he can guarantee that we generate the subgraphs in the optimal order of enumeration without compromising any of the other constraints that we have. So the two main operations in his algorithm are extension and cloning. So the use of anchor vertices is actually quite simple. It compromises the optimal order of enumeration, actually. Okay, but it simplifies the problem a lot. So essentially, what he's saying is, instead of trying to generate all connected subgraphs, I will generate all connected subgraphs that contain a given vertex. When you do that, then checking for connectivity becomes very easy because you have an anchor vertex that connects everything. So by doing a search through that vertex, you can enumerate all connected subgraphs very quickly, and then once you are done with that vertex, you can remove that vertex and its edges and repeat this process again. Again, this compromises the optimal order of enumeration, obviously, right? But you can heuristically choose the order of the vertices that you use as the anchor to minimize that effect. So then, I will really explain this within the boundaries of my intellectual capacity. Whenever Sean came to me, always the discussion would go like, I would explain, I would tell him, okay, Sean, let me understand what we are doing. And I would explain to him as I will explain to you now, and then he would correct me again and again. But this is what I understand, and I still believe that I get the spirit of it. But I think there are some nuts and bolts that only Sean can explain. So essentially the idea is this. So if we simplify the problem as just enumerating all the subgraphs that contain the immediate neighbors of a given node. So a given node is A here, and I just want to generate all the subgraphs that contain A and its immediate neighbors. Then this can be done using a binomial tree, right? So the entire algorithm is based on this observation. So now the order in which you generate that binomial tree is you first, in lexicographic order, you first add one of the vertices and evaluate. Okay? Then you add the second vertex as a child and evaluate. And then you clone the previous branches. And at that point you evaluate, and if you will reject a subgraph, you reject it at that point. And then now when you add the third vertex, when you clone it, the subgraphs that you generate are already pruned subgraphs. So this is the main idea. So this also gives rise to two types of branches, depth branches and breadth branches, where depth branches are those that are generated by extension, right? Those are the immediate neighbors of our anchor node, whereas the breadth branches are those that are created by cloning, meaning that the connectivity is inferred because they are connected through our anchor vertex. So the classification of the depth branches and breadth branches turns out to be important when you are trying to prove the properties of this algorithm, because essentially using those depth and breadth branches, you can classify the different cases you will run into in the case of cycles and things like that. So, but this is only, again, for the problem of generating all subsets of the immediate neighbors of a given node. But it turns out that it's very easy to generalize this. So now, once you generate that binomial tree, what you can do is, for each internal node in this tree represents a specific subgraph. So when you are extending from that node, all you need to do is really consider that subgraph as a vertex in the graph and repeat the same thing. And here comes the nuts and bolts that, again, Sean explains every time, but, I will keep it that here, so you can generalize this again by just, recursively applying this idea in a way that you treat each subgraph as a vertex in the graph. So based on this algorithm, we were able to prove that, this algorithm satisfied the basic properties, like it is complete, it doesn't have any redundancy, it doesn't have any overhead. And second, we were able to prove that we can't guarantee that there won't be any redundant rejections, but we can guarantee that there are no redundant rejections for a given anchor vertex. So if you frame the question as, I want to enumerate all subgraphs that contain a given vertex, then we can guarantee that there will be no redundant rejections. Then you can enumerate the graphs in the correct order. So to test whether this pays off, whether really if minimizing redundant rejections helps with anything, we came up with a very simple setup, a very simple toy problem. So we took the human PPI network from HPRD and also a citation network from arXiv to get an idea of what's going on. Both of them have in the order of thousands of nodes and in the order of 10,000s of edges. And the problem that we defined is we assigned random weights to the vertices, and then we are looking for maximal subgraphs such that the total weight doesn't exceed a given threshold. So with this setup, what we can do is, by playing with the standard deviation of the node weights, we can adjust the difficulty of the problem. And then by playing with the mean of this distribution and the threshold we use, we can play with the size of the output, how many subgraphs this will return. So this gave us full control on the problem, essentially. So if the problem is easy, if the node weights are not very different, then as you can see, you won't gain much compared to that first enumeration if you use an algorithm like ours. But as the problem gets more and more difficult, we started seeing the difference. So here, essentially, we are plotting the fraction of redundant rejections as a function of the threshold. So as the threshold goes up, the problem gets easier in the sense that there will be more and more subgraphs that will be eliminated. So as the threshold gets lower and lower, actually the problem is more difficult, and there actually the earnings are even more. And same for the arXiv network. Essentially, we see a huge gap between, when the problem is difficult, we see a huge gap between their first enumeration versus this principled enumeration that Sean developed. So this also translates into runtime. Again, when we look at the runtime as a function of the threshold, we see that the runtime goes up as a function of threshold, by the way, right? But the Sean's algorithm does much better than depth-first enumeration. So then we also went back to the biological problem that was inspiring for this work, and at the time when we published the results of Crane on glioblastoma, we used the original implementation, which was a depth-first search, the depth-first enumeration implementation. So by using the same setup, we asked the question, if we did it using Shan's algorithm, how efficient would it be? And it turned out that actually, and this is, as you can see, this algorithm takes quite a bit of time, but with Shan's algorithm, we improved runtime quite a bit. So essentially, this doesn't have to be real time or anything. I think you can afford to spend a lot of time, but as you can see, for many instances, this improvement can make the algorithm feasible, applicable. So the conclusion is, we have an algorithm to enumerate all connected subgraphs specifically that satisfy a hereditary property that's quantifiable. It outperforms depth-first enumeration. So, for example, in this context of graph mining, depth-first enumeration is still the state of the art, so you can use this instead. But one question remains open, and I don't know the answer to this question. Can you really completely eliminate redundant rejections? Because we changed the problem's definition a little to be able to eliminate redundant rejections. So I would like to thank Shan for this work, and I really enjoy working with him. He always comes up with these really nice ideas and forces me to think about theory when I am always busy with biology. And Mark for giving us really inspiring biological problems. I would like to thank my other students who have contributed to this work or another in a way. And then again, Selim was the first person who developed the algorithm that gave rise to this problem. And then I would also like to thank all of our collaborators, including Rodet here. And I thank him for doing a great job describing our joint work, presenting our joint work together. So thank you very much, and I am happy to answer your questions. And by the way, one thing that I forgot to note is actually Fabio will be presenting, right, in Recomb, an algorithm that solves a specific problem, but they compared their algorithm against enumeration, and they used this algorithm for enumeration. So they took the time to understand this algorithm and implement this algorithm instead of implementing an inefficient enumeration algorithm as a straw man. So congratulations to them, and I was really happy to see that.
Told me for doing it. Yeah. My student will be presenting, and he's the one that implemented the algorithm. So,
questions? I have actually a question. Do you, in any of the very fast, do you ever beat DFS? So it looks like you do really well against DFS when it's a harder problem in some sense in terms of complexity. When it gets very, very easy, it looks like you're almost exactly DFS. Did you see that in any other examples or most examples? Was that always the case? I
think it's always the case. Because when it is easy, there is nothing to prune out, essentially. Yeah. That's the problem. So actually, when it is easy, it is not easy in terms of the computational time. And you just need to do it.
Yeah. Good. Okay. More questions? Let's thank Mehmet again.
Thank you.